Good afternoon. I'm Susan Zesch. I know most people here in the audience. I'm director of the Human Rights Program, a job which it has been my pleasure to have for the last 7 years. I myself am an alum from the class of 1972. And when I was in college, the only way to do something interesting abroad or out in the world of social justice organizations in the U.S. was to drop out. And one of my good friends did that, went and dropped out, went to work in Europe and later in Central America, and now has 2 Pulitzer Prizes. But he had to leave the college in order to be able to do that. In 2001, almost 30 years after I graduated, I was interviewed by John Boyer for the position of being director of the Human Rights Program. And John Boyer convinced me that the college was a different college in terms of its relationship with the outside world. He talked, as the historian he is, of the difference in a university organized along the principles of our first president, William Rainey Harper, versus the university as organized along the principles as set out by the Chancellor Robert Maynard Hutchins, and talked to me about how his notion of the college as a body within the university was more in line with Harper's original conceptions of a university engaged with the world around us. So since I had suffered in the late 60s, early 70s as a student who thought we were on the right side of history, but in a difficult position within the institution as to pushing the institution to be more responsive to the world around us. I was very happy 29 years later to come back to a college whose leadership really was in favor of students engaging with the world. The Human Rights Program represents some of what I think is the best of the university's desire to blend theory and practice. We do curriculum, as you know. We not only have a wonderful curriculum of liberal arts courses at an ever-increasing number for our own students, but through a 3-institution project we're doing with Carleton and McAllister and a website we've set up, and through our graduate students who teach human rights courses here and then have positions elsewhere, we are also seeding human rights teaching in the liberal arts in other universities around the country. And Ev Mead's going to talk a bit about his own personal experience with that. We also do events. Many of you who are here who are alums as students in the Human Rights Program were involved in developing conferences on human rights problems in Colombia, on genocide, on a wide range of topics. You got important training outside the course content of courses in doing that. We just recently, in the spring quarter, had a major conference on genocide. The keynote speaker was Sir Francis Deng, who is now the United Nations Special Advisor to the Secretary General for the Prevention of Genocide. And we, on Thursday night, had our 2nd annual Robert Kirshner Memorial Lecture, which brought over 250 people to International House to hear the writer Alex Kotlowitz talk about the role of stories in human rights. Now, many of you here are alums of the Human Rights Internship Program. Can I see hands? Because it's true out in the audience. Great. And after this session, all of the Human Rights Internship alums are going over to the Franke Institute at 3 o'clock, which is in Regenstein, for those of you who don't remember. And we're going to have an internal evaluation session because we're very seriously interested in listening to your comments. We did do an informal survey. I'm going to just talk for one more minute because we have too many interesting people on the panel for me to take up the time. We did an informal survey and got about 40 responses back. We have survey forms for people who didn't get a chance to fill it out and want to. And the two things that our graduates told us, and at this point it's only anecdotal, it's not really scientific, it's not a big enough survey, but there were 2 things that shone through in the responses which make us understand what is very special about the University of Chicago, the college experience here, and the Human Rights Program. The #1 course that students cited as their favorite course in human rights was philosophy of human rights, either with Alan Gaworth or Michael Green. And that tells us something about our students' interest in really exploring deep and difficult questions. The second most commonly cited thing they wanted to see in the Human Rights Program was skills training of a sort like how to write a grant proposal. And so the fact, and I told John Boyer this the other day, that our students are deeply rooted in philosophy and also very concerned with understanding how things work in the real world. And I think this panel of alums is going to show you how that works its way out in their years after college, law school. No, not law school. We don't have a law grad here. We have college, graduate programs in Middle East civilizations, PhDs in history, medical school, etc. Those of you who are in the audience who also were interns, I want to thank you for coming. We're very much looking forward to the session with you. And I also wanted to just publicly thank two of our donors who are here and very interested in talking to people, Richard and Ann Silver-Posen, who have supported the internship program over a number of years, and this past December gave us a donation of $1 million to set up an endowment for a visiting distinguished professor of human rights. A faculty committee has met and considered various applications, and the first distinguished visiting professor in not this next academic year, but the year after, will be Albie Sachs, who is retiring. Yeah, who is retiring as a justice of the Constitutional Court in South Africa at the end of 2009, and will be happy to come here following his retirement to teach in the college for a term. So we're very pleased and want to thank you. Since the bios of our panelists are in this handout you have, I'm not going to repeat them. I'm just going to hand the mic down the row and suggest that people think about what is the best 5 to 8 minutes you can tell to get a discussion going, because we also have some great stories in the audience, and I think we can have some interesting comments and give and take with the audience. Evmead is first. Then you can
Great, thanks. No, I think I'm just going to stick this back in. Okay. Can you hear me? Is that, no? Yes? Yes.
Are we taping?
Good. Okay.
But we're taping.
Oh, we're taping. Oh, pardon me. Okay. Well, I think I'm probably the only person up here who wasn't an intern. My experience with the program was much more as a student and as a teacher. I started in the human rights program, I think it was the year that it started, 1997. I took the undergraduate sequence. I went on to become a TA in the program and a lecturer for a couple of different courses in the program. And served on the advisory board with India, and I'm sure a number of you who are the student representatives. So if I had to say one thing about the human rights program in terms of what it gave me as a student, and it's something I'm sure many of you share, I can't use any language that's any weaker than this. It actually really saved my faith in the university, and as a university professor, that's really important. I was about a year from going on the job market. I had finished a big chunk of my dissertation, and I was completely and totally fed up with the university. I had proposed several courses that were turned down. I had proposed turning my dissertation in a human rights direction. I had people question the work that I was doing outside of the classroom, doing things like working on individual immigration and asylum cases. And people, it's not that people saw those things in a negative light, but they couldn't see how they could contribute to a dissertation project. And the Human Rights Program provided a vehicle for explaining this stuff that really didn't water down the academic content at all. In fact, it made it sharper. So as an individual intellectual and as a researcher, the Human Rights Program gave me a way of saying, most of us get involved in this stuff because there's some particular piece of moral indignation that piques us, some story that we want to explain, and then you hide it. And you bury it in a historiography or in a theory section, and you revive it as a provocative prologue to a book. The Human Rights Program sort of said, no, it's okay, you should focus on that because that's why you got involved in this in the first place, and you can speak about it in an analytically sharp way. So it really saved me. It kept me in a PhD program, and it inspired me in teaching. And then I have to say, it was the most fun teaching that I have ever done. I had the smartest students. They can make anyone teaching these courses feel absolutely brilliant because you can throw out a sort of half-baked philosophical question and they fill in all the blanks and make it sound like it was perfectly planned. So you could teach a totally Socratic class, half prepared, and the students would fill in all the gaps and come up with all kinds of brilliant answers. So it's really great for lazy faculty. I'm kidding. Very much. And it continues to be a part of what I'm doing, not just for the 4 or 8 or 9 dozen law school recommendation letters that I continue to write for University of Chicago students, even though I haven't been here in 4 years. I'm kidding. I'm always pleased to do them. And graduate school of every different stripe. And several of the students actually I worked with in the Human Rights Program have continued on to PhD programs in history, too. But it's enriched my teaching at another institution and helped in curriculum development. I teach at the University of California, San Diego. I'm an historian. As an historian, I'm a pretty conventional historian. I work on the history of modern Mexico and human rights, which has always been kind of after the and so far. I'm still kind of working on how to convince everyone that it is part of the discipline of human rights. And the Human Rights 2 and 3 courses have been particularly useful there. But we just started a human rights program. And I met with a group of faculty, and we sat down, and they said, well, what can we do? What can we do to get students involved? And it didn't take very long for me to say, well, start an internship program. Fund them to do summer projects. Give them, say, I don't know, $5,000 to go. And they said, well, what would they teach? What would they teach? And I said, well, let's have a curriculum meeting. And I showed up at a curriculum meeting, and I had worked as a curriculum coordinator for Susan, and I developed kind of a human rights master plan syllabus, which incorporates things from all of the 3 core courses that are still taught in the program, plus a lot of other ideas kind of worked in. And so I'd been working on this for years, but I kind of pretended I put it together that weekend. It was like I crossed a few things out with dates that said 2004 on them and things. I showed up with this packet of materials, and I sort of set it down, and I said, well, we could try this. And we've done it, and we turned it into a program, and it passed the University of California bureaucratic system, which is really amazing. It's 7 universities with 1 administration. It's daunting. And we'll start teaching the courses next year. We give our first internship this year, and we really model a lot of what we're doing on this program. So I owe a lot to the Human Rights Program. And I'll pass this off to Rohini, who comes at this from a totally different perspective. She's a practicing medical doctor, which totally frightens me.
Thanks, Ev. So Ev was actually one of my TAs when I took the human rights class, actually. And so I went to college here, and I graduated in 2001, and then I chose to go to medical school here as well. And I think one of the reasons that I chose to do medical school here, outside of loving the BSLC, was that I think I felt very at home at the Human Rights Program, and I realized that I could accomplish more while I was here in medical school than if I went somewhere else and they didn't have this other program that I could also be involved in. So I think I did, the internship that I did in college sort of led me to be more and more involved in the Human Rights Program when I was in medical school, which was interesting because when I was here and everyone's in med school, everyone's taking the same classes, it was really great to get away and sort of have this other thing that I was so involved in and so interested in. And since being there, I think it's informed a lot of the decisions I've made and a lot of the choices I've made for what I want to do. And I think when you come at it from a health perspective, you automatically you have more of an orientation towards like humanitarian issues and development. And I think in all of these situations when the government has an obligation towards its people, it's kind of like rights, and so I've sort of come at it from there. And so I've chosen to do my residency at Bellevue Hospital, which is the main city hospital in New York City, and it has this huge population of mostly immigrants and impoverished people. It's a free hospital, basically. And going there with a human rights perspective, I think, has given me such a different view as to how to treat patients and how to sort of look at where they're coming from. And so one of the main things that Bellevue Hospital has is that it has a survivors of torture program. So people who are survivors of torture and come to the hospital or come to the emergency room where I work have the opportunity to, if they claim that they're survivors of torture, they get plugged into the network and they get free health care, just general medical care, but also psychiatric, social, and legal services as well through Bellevue Hospital. And so I've been working with them a lot, and I think it's kind of interesting. And more recently, I was working with the Millennium Village Project out of Columbia University, and working with the government in Senegal and the local government there, as well as with the UNDP. And it's also informed my work as an emergency physician, and I think it just changes the perspective that you come at it from and makes you more of a, I guess, a giver. And so despite the long hours and the harsh conditions, I think it gives you, it makes it seem more worth it when you look back on it. So I'll introduce Nick here.
Rohini, by the way, got involved in the Millennium Village Project by writing I understand, a fan letter to Jeffrey Sachs, and when he read about who she was, he invited her to help do a needs survey at some of the projects that they were doing in Senegal.
Yeah. I
Nick.
read his book and I wrote him a fan letter.
So, for those who don't know me, my name is Nick Jurovich, and I graduated in 2006 with a BA in history. And I had an internship in 2004 after my second year. And I a couple of things that came to mind when I was sort of thinking through this and the ways in which human rights influenced me both sort of as I was at the college and then afterwards. I came to the program very kind of green. I was sort of second year. I came in for an interview. I remember that as I left, Maureens and Andreas and people who interviewed me were kind of laughing. And later they told me they were laughing because they thought I was really enthusiastic and that was great, but I was sort of horrified. I'm sure I didn't get an internship. And I worked on staff then at the program my third and fourth year. And it really became a family for me, with Susan as the mom and Maureens as kind of the cool aunt, and maybe Irving Berkner as kind of the grumpy uncle or something. But is Irving around? No, I guess not. Oh, someone tell him I said that. But and I mean that not just sort of to be cute, but also that it was a really small and nurturing environment where you could, bring all sorts of problems, not just sort of problems you had with academics, but sort of questions you had about human rights, about sort of how you were relating to things, about sort of just indignities, things that really frustrated you. And there was this wonderful group also of sort of brothers and sisters, all the interns and the sort of staff who were there to sort of talk with and really, in a very comfortable and nurturing way, get through some really difficult issues. And you need these sort of smaller groups. You can't do all of this in social class. You can't do all of this on your own writing an essay to sort of really work through some of these things and figure out how you think about it, how you articulate some of this stuff. And the human rights program was really instrumental for me in sort of figuring out how to talk about these things and interact with stuff that really frustrated me or struck me as sort of unjust initially, but I couldn't kind of work through it as a sophomore or something. The second thing, I really admire the way the Human Rights Program chooses its interns, because I think they're very careful not just to pick people who are very qualified initially, but also to pick people who they see some sort of potential in. And in that respect, it really is a teaching program, because I'm sure they could have given an internship to someone besides me who had more experience and could have sort of accomplished more things in 10 weeks, perhaps, than I did. I was at the Center on Housing Rights and Evictions in Johannesburg and was sort of really just finding my feet for the first few weeks of the internship, figuring out what I was going to do, how I could work in this environment, and very much shocked by the things I was reading about evictions in Southern Africa and sort of, in some ways sort of frozen by that. But by giving me access to this, one, it really, turned me on to trying to do this kind of work and study these sorts of things as a history student as well, in a way that I think changed what I do and also, allowed me to really focus on human rights issues. I actually sort of study Chicago and now Britain, which obviously aren't South Africa, but it's, to relate these kinds of issues to academics in a way that I probably wouldn't have been able to had I not had this experience. And also it's, encouraged me to go on and try now to sort of seek out jobs in this arena, which I'm doing right now. And I think, that one of the great things about human rights sort of internship program is that they find people who have potential, who are excited about these sorts of things, and get them out there and sort of give them their first sort of, sort of chip or card or hand to play in this sort of, battle of accumulating things and trying to get yourself out there and get positions. And it's, it's a wonderful thing for people who come out of high school without a lot of this sort of experience, who just, I came from a public high school, didn't have a lot of background besides working at a convenience store. So these kinds of things are really great to get as you get to college, and the program really provides that. The last thing, in terms of sort of, I studied the civil rights movement here in Chicago as an undergraduate and wrote a BA thesis on that. And I'm just finishing a 2-year master's on history in Oxford, where I looked at the sort of civil rights movement in Britain and the ways in which it was influenced by the transnational connections to the United States, to Caribbean, to South Asia, and also to Africa in terms of independence movements, post-colonial movements. And when I look at these things, what comes out of and this is post-war history, and it's a sort of specific subset of history. The scholars at Oxford called it yesterday when I told them what I do. But it is, it is very much influenced by the existence of a human rights regime, a human rights paradigm in the post-war world. And in terms of human rights as an academic program, as an academic discipline, I think this really speaks to the value of studying these things in a very serious way, because it tells you that, in the same way we make arguments about some of the newcomer disciplines to the academy, area studies, gender studies, black studies, these kinds of things, the argument is that you want to see the world, you want to understand a certain experience, you want to understand a certain set of, human institutions, you have to understand a set of perspectives that you might not get from sort of traditional disciplines. And in the same way, human rights can really inform. If you sort of take these things seriously and look at the ways in which the language and the structure of these kinds of human rights institutions have affected what people do on the ground as, sort of organizers when they look to form a civil rights movement in Britain, which is quite sort of unexpected, and most people haven't heard about it. But they are very effective at looking to other movements, at thinking about things in a transnational context. And that, to my mind, is really a product of the existence of this human rights regime. And it's a reason to study it then. I remember getting a question when I was doing this interview for the Rhodes Scholarship from a UC faculty member who will remain nameless, who basically said, I don't think human rights is an academic discipline. I don't see why it's an academic program. And at the time what I told him, and sort of this was this first question I got, so sort of like, oh, thanks. Anyway, but what I said was, this wasn't the UFC committee. This was in the Chicago interview. Susan was on the UFC committee, which made it nice. But what I said at the time was, well, what we try to do is bring together people from different disciplines to look at very pressing issues, to approach these things from lots of different angles. And I think that's true, but it didn't quite talk about all of what the Human Rights Program does, which is bring people together to really study human rights in a way that's, in some sense, its own discipline, to really experience and understand these things beyond just sort of, as a historian I do human rights, or as an economist, but that there is a discipline, there is a field here to really engage with and understand and take seriously, and that does inform human experience, particularly in the sort of modern post-war era. And so as I kind of continue on doing this history stuff, I really find myself returning to the sorts of things we read, the sorts of things we did in the human rights courses. And I think it's been really valuable in ways that I probably didn't expect at first. So those are the sorts of sets of experience I had from human rights. And yeah.
Great. So we've had an academic, a doctor, somebody else just finishing graduate school and at the fork of a road between academia, activism, and now Christina Moon. And Christina, would you mention in your discussion a little bit about what you did as an undergrad here with the Thai-Burma border trip? And okay.
I think the first thing, though, is that I want to say thank you for having me here. And I've always been in awe and really respected the people that I'm sitting next to. So it feels really weird that I'm up here. I feel like I should be in the audience instead. But I'm also really thankful because I was reflecting a lot on what I was going to say today and thinking, and I think I didn't realize how thankful I was for the Human Rights Program. And I always knew I appreciated it immensely, but now I got really emotional actually as I was figuring out what I was going to say. And I tried to think of an illustration that would maybe represent to me what the Human Rights Program was while I was an undergraduate, and I could only sort of think of some sort of living organism like a tree or a body or something. That hallway in Pick is always so vibrant and buzzing with life. And a lot of the people who are here and who are on this panel were really like at the core, the spine of that body. I was always sort of on the margins because I came to Chicago not with the sort of typical perspective on human rights that I think a lot of other students did. I came sort of married to a cause and very much, devoted and in love with a particular country that I wanted to work on somewhat indefinitely, and I still feel that way about Burma. What the Human Rights Program allowed me to do, though, was sort of come in whenever I had, for example, like a speaking event, a speaking event, a panel, an activity, or the delegations to the Thai-Burma border. I could always bring them to the Human Rights Program, and from this body would grow like this limb to come out and support me, bringing the financial resources and the expertise and the networks and just the emotional support that's so vital to any of those things happening. The Thai-Burma border delegations that Susan mentioned were pretty out there. I don't think that it had ever been done before in the university, but I had been to the Thai-Burma border for the first time in 2002, and I fell in love with the place, and I was like, okay, now I'm doing Burma forever. So I thought, there aren't too many other students who know what's going on, so maybe I need to replicate that experience for some students. And I came up with this crazy idea of taking a group of 13 University of Chicago undergrads and graduate students and 2 professors and a MAPS preceptor to the Thai-Burma border. And we visited refugee camps, and we met with former political prisoners and people who were very much involved in the refugee situation, but also in creating, really revolution and political change and human rights education and activism inside Burma. And it was a nutso idea. And it was a budget that I had never, I was not thinking in the terms of like tens of thousands of dollars. And, you know, I had never managed anything that was more than like a film series screening that was like $200. And all of a sudden I was like, okay, I'm responsible for the security of like 15 people. Anyway, I'm sorry. That was a long-winded sort of departure from what I meant to say, which is that the Human Rights Program really was this family, and I'm an incessant Burma advocate, and I think, like Evan was sort of suggesting, there were a lot of ways in which the greater university wasn't very happy with that, but I could always come back to the Human Rights Program and get that support from the family. But also what was so much more powerful was to be able to undergird my practice. I mean, the practice of advocacy and human rights was always here, and I talked about Burma all the time, so that wasn't lacking at all. But the theory that undergirded everything and makes the practice of human rights robust and effective, that is what I really got from the University of Chicago, in addition to just this network of support and being able to look around and see what everyone was doing in different areas or in different fields, and figuring out how that was applicable to what I wanted to do, and also what you know, Burma could bring to the international human rights regime in return. Coming back now, Shana Plaut walked in. She saw me when I was a first year in college, and I totally leapfrogged. I did everything. I tend to do things kind of ass backwards sometimes. I took the Human Rights 3 class first, so Human Rights and International Relations, and I was 18, and I had no idea what I was doing. But I wrote my final paper on how this law that was written by George Washington to protect European merchants against the Barbary pirates was being used and applied to the situation in Burma, holding an American oil company vicariously liable for human rights abuses committed by the military regime in Burma because they'd been hired to build and protect this American company's pipeline. And now we're coming full circle, and in the past month, people have been talking about invoking a very new norm of the responsibility to protect, to justify humanitarian intervention in Burma after Burma was hit by a Class 4 cyclone on May 2nd. And boy, I mean, full circle, I'm sitting here saying, like, I'm so glad that I'm in Chicago now thinking about this, because this sort of integrated theory and practice approach, looking at international law, looking at the international human rights regime and what everyone here is doing, which is spectacular, and applying it to my work, that's something that I want to bring back and do a lot. So I do believe in a lot of things happening because of right timing and right placement. You're just in the right place at the right time and given the opportunity to do something amazing. And that's what the Human Rights Internship really did for me. I mean, it's being here, but it's also, you know, I saw it when I was on the Thai-Burma border. It was from being able to be there that I gained, a lot of credibility and legitimacy in the work that I do, and a lot of relationships that I still draw on that still really inform my work. But one of the most important things that ever happened in my life came out of being there, which was, one of my students took me across the border into Burma, which I think Susan was always terrified would happen, then I'd get arrested or something. And we went into Karen State, in this area that had been razed and demolished by the Burma Army. And she said, when I was a kid, there was a school here, and now there's no school, but I'd really like to build one, and will you help me? And not knowing at all what I was doing, I said yes. And then in the next 3 years, I was responsible for the education, healthcare, welfare of 75 children who'd been orphaned and displaced. And I'm really upset because the school doesn't exist anymore. The conflict sort of took back that gift that it had given to me. But I'm so thankful for having been able to be there, and I wouldn't have gotten there if it wasn't for all of you, and I wouldn't be doing what I was doing today. So thank you so much.
Thanks. I also, just thinking about the Human Rights Program, I came fairly late to it. I was an undergraduate here for 4 years, graduated in '02, and had done medieval history, and came into the human rights program when I was a graduate student after I'd come back and was doing, again, Middle Eastern studies. And I really like what Nick had said about this being a place that accepted people who maybe were still seekers and looking for how they could give back, because that certainly is the category that I would fall into. I had done grassroots, small entrepreneurial venture in the developing world before I'd come to college. I then in college had done medieval history, had worked doing oral history in a year between, and was figuring out a number of different ways that I wanted to work, knew that I wanted to work in the Middle East or in at least developing countries, emerging markets, whatever you call them, and was working, I think, through a Susan connection, also at Merck here in Chicago that year, working with post-9/11 immigrants, with Arab and Muslim immigrants who were facing a lot of troubles in those years, in 2003 and 2004. And was lucky enough to receive a human rights internship. And that's, I think, what I'd like to talk about most, because that directly led to what I'm doing today, which is a bit of a blend of for-profit capitalist investment along with, human rights values, which is microfinance, something that some of you, I'm sure, have heard of, which is essentially small loans to entrepreneurs in developing countries, which is, I think, falls within the sphere of economic rights and has implications as people increase their own livelihood and add value to their communities, to also alleviating political problems, social problems, and I think has widespread results. But it's looking at it from a for-profit model, much in the way that Google Foundation, for example, made their foundation a for-profit organization, and trying to harness the power of the market or people's greed or whatever you want to call it to essentially drive, take solutions to these issues to a much more systemic place than, say, an international development project, which is led by a policy idea, one that typically is dictated by governments, foreign governments. So my human rights internship was to Azerbaijan to work with internally displaced persons from the war with Armenia. And I was working with Save the Children, and when I first got there, I had absolutely no idea what I was going to be doing, other than I wanted to be in Azerbaijan. And had a project around IDPs that I wanted to work with Save the Children on, because they worked in that area, but didn't know specifically the content of the work. And found myself, for the first half of the internship, doing sort of classic international development work, community development work, where you mobilize the community, and you certainly are trying to build civil society and funneling resources for infrastructure, health, and further things like that. But this was 2004, which was 10 years after the war had closed with Armenia. So there were refugees that 10 years later were still living in train cars, dugout holes, and temporary camps, and had not been allowed to settle, much in the situation in Lebanon, Syria, et cetera, where the host government of the camps won't let people settle because they don't want to give up that political urgency. They don't want the international community to forget that they've been wronged and that they still need a solution. And so the international aid groups had been there and trying to develop infrastructure, but actually had been somewhat blocked by the political forces that be. And so while I was there, these community development projects were being phased out and winding down. And there was the one project that had started with a $100,000 grant, was a small NGO, separate NGO that had now was transitioning into actually a bank, and was a microfinance bank that gave about $60 loans to refugee entrepreneurs in those areas, so that they could do anything from purchase a bike so that they could take their garden products to a different market that they otherwise couldn't reach, or provide other types of services in their communities, purchase a cow so that they could milk the cow, produce cheese, and sell it in the local market. And were able to actually establish a livelihood and in many cases were able to bring themselves out of poverty in that particular situation. And when I was there, this bank not only had not run out of the money that they were given, they had about $700,000 now in the 10 years since they had gotten that grant. And today, I'm happy to say they have $2.5 million in their portfolio, and they continue to give loans and service that. And so to me, that was a very powerful thing to see, that one could, in fact, harness the market and be able to serve a population in need and help their problems. And you saw that bank, I would say, and the loans that it provided, which in every case was not successful. I mean, there were cases where people were not good businessmen, you know, they ended up, or women, and ended up losing their businesses, and that was unfortunate. But you did see, I think, a net impact that was positive. And I was very inspired by that experience when I went back to New York afterwards, after I graduated and finished. I ended up working on a fund which essentially invests in these microfinance banks all over the world in different countries. And I'm happy to say that today we've established it as a significant fund, and we're actively funding over 400,000 entrepreneurs in the developing world on a yearly basis. And so that, so now I'm very much in this intersection of profit, capitalism, and human rights, and it's something that I'm very grateful to the University of Chicago for providing me with.
And Maureen Tracy Mooney was another of Ev's students.
He didn't seem very lazy at the time. I don't think you can exude that much energy and enthusiasm and be lazy. I'm Maureens Tracy Mooney. I graduated in 2005 with a degree in history, but I was kind of I was a philosophy major until the last week of my third year, when I decided that I was going to transfer to history, basically because I had come up with all of these thesis proposals that sort of wove human rights into them, and they all kind of, you know, it wasn't philosophy. So I switched to history, and then I, of course, proceeded to take the fall quarter of my senior year off to volunteer full-time in Ohio at home for John Kerry's campaign. So it was only actually a history major and taking classes for 2 quarters. But because the history department accepted so many human rights classes as credits, I managed to graduate on time, which was kind of miraculous. But so I was a history major, and for me, I've been thinking a lot about the human rights program, and I think I owe almost every little small details of my life, like my boyfriend and where I work, to the human rights program. I met Frank at a party at Maureens' house through Indy, who I worked with and then shared an apartment with, to my job, my thoughts about the world, why I'm committed to living my life the way I am, to the human rights program. So I'm wholly indebted. I can't imagine who I would be without the human rights program. I had received an internship the summer after my second year and went to work in Belfast, in North Belfast, on an economic and social rights project that was just getting started. It was sponsored by a union and a legal rights organization, and me and my cousin were the only full-time staff. And we were working out of the union offices. The basic gist of the project then was to in Northern Ireland, out of the Good Friday Agreement, they're covered by both the British and Irish Constitution, so they have economic and social rights. So our role was trying to encourage community organizations to use a rights framework in their work and their activism, in arguing for funding, because they had all these rights that they were fulfilling themselves to the communities they were serving, and weren't being properly funded to do so, and the government wasn't fulfilling its role in relation to those rights. So we were doing research around disparities in the community, and I talked about the right to health care over and over and over that summer, and the right to mental health care over and over and over again that summer. And I came back after that summer, going into my third year, and I was like, there's a right to health care. What an interesting, novel idea. That's something where I had always felt like, yeah, people should have health care, but it hadn't occurred to me until I lived and worked in that environment that it might be a living, breathing right that you could actually argue should be enforced. And I came back and was all healthcare all the time my junior and senior years at the college, and wrote my senior thesis on it and worked for the SEIU after I graduated on a healthcare project. And then because of Susan, got a job at the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, and through that ended up working on Barack Obama's campaign, which is what I'm currently doing. And it's just been an incredible experience. And for me, I think one of the big lessons from the Human Rights Program is that it turns people who, I think, like Christina, like all of us, came into the college with a sort of vague sense of what we wanted to do with ourselves and with our lives. We were committed to social justice. We knew kind of what was important to us. But what the Human Rights Program does is says, okay, now what? And challenges you to think critically about the issues that you're concerned about, and rewards you for doing that, and sparks your imagination. You learn about ways that you can make a life doing human rights work, which I think is a critically important part of the program. It really gives you opportunities to imagine what your life would be like if you dedicated yourself to that work, both through meeting alumni who have done that, through the coursework, through learning about every summer all these great stories come back from interns around the world talking about the different work that's going on, and it really gets you to think about what specifically you might do to make a difference in a critical fashion. So it's been an incredible gift to me. I think that I just can't imagine what my experience at the university would have been like without it. And I am so excited to hear about the big boosted numbers of interns and the more funding that we're getting, just because I think about, backtracking. I think about not only the effect that we're having, individual lives that are transformed like mine and Christina's and other people in this room, but, also the little, pools of impact that we're having around the world. I just got back from Belfast. I hadn't been back since I worked there that summer, and my boyfriend had spent the last year in Belfast studying and started interning at the same project I worked on, and has now been hired full-time and is staying through February. But it was amazing because I went straight from the airport to this huge...
It's okay, Mo, you're going to be busy straight through January.
Right,
so.
there you go. I went straight from the airport to this huge all-day conference they were doing, a residence jury. The project is now focusing on a couple issues, including development. And what they're doing is saying, listen, if we have concepts like healthcare and mental health care and housing that people say, we don't know how to enforce it because we don't know what that means. Well, the project has said, well, maybe we should ask communities what that means and get the communities themselves to design the standards that they think should be enforced. So they brought together a residence jury that is putting together these standards for a development plan in the community, and they brought in international experts who are testifying about what a participatory process might mean in terms of development. And then Frank got up there and gave this rousing speech and presentation, and it was such a dramatic demonstration of how far this project has grown in the 5 years and all the different people that have been brought into that process. So it was just incredibly meaningful for me, and I'm deeply indebted.
Great. I think one way to get a little discussion started to do for a few minutes is just see if among the panelists, any of you has a question for any of the other panelists that you can think of. Ev was taking notes.
I have a question for Ev. I was wondering what the biggest obstacles were at UCSD in getting the program developed and going and approved.
Actually, I think because of programs, and this program was the most constant example, but there are other very good human rights programs around the country too. It was much easier probably than it would have been 5 or 10 years ago. The biggest argument, students will enroll in courses, and that's never really a problem. The biggest argument is I think what Nick was bringing this up, and I was taking notes actually on what he was saying. It's really hard to make a disciplinary argument, to go to historians, to go to anthropologists, to go to people anywhere in the social sciences and humanities and argue that the material itself has intellectual coherence. And I think the arguments are there. I mean, my answer kept being giving people lists of books and saying, just read the books. It'll come across. But it's because it is a little bit difficult to define, you know, because I think when we talk about human rights, we're talking about something that's more than just, I mean, empathy is a really important component, but it's more than that. It's a particular kind of empathy. It's a way of imagining a kind of systematic empathy, a way of approaching the world. And that's hard to explain, and so sometimes not being able to shorthand it, I think, was the biggest obstacle.
Anybody else in the panel have a question? There are questions from the audience? Or stories from the audience? I mean, I just know, looking at who's here, that there's some stories equally compelling. Richard?
Yeah, the question was what the value of the program is for students who might not have an internship but take courses or work as staff or maybe even just come to events. I think, I mean, one of the things that I really loved about the program and admired about it, and I probably sort of dove in as far as I could, having an internship, taking the courses, working on the staff, but is that it has all these levels that people can interact with. So someone who's not particularly interested in human rights language or even has real problems with it will still come to some of these events because we bring in really interesting speakers, or we'll have, you know, a really sort of lively roundtable with a group of people talking about a particular issue. And so I think it draws people in. And I know there are people who then come to it, you know, and say, I really like to get an internship, and at first they sort of, you know, they'll interview and they won't get one, and it'll be because, you know, just need to work on something or need more experience in the language of human rights, how to frame their kinds of arguments, and then the program really does provide that. So people who really sort of go after internships do tend to get them, I think. And, you know, if you don't get it the first time, a lot of people get it the second time. And get it through the coursework and through interacting with the program and the events and things. And the other thing is, again, like what Christina was saying, the program is just really great at responding to students' sort of needs and desires. So if you have someone who says, haven't had an internship, I've taken the courses, I really want to organize this, or I'm really interested in this issue, Susan, Maureen, other people in the program are great at saying, well, here's a way to do this, here's a way to think about it. You know, staff in the program often just sort of will end up being liaisons to one thing or another. So I worked on the Cartemquin film series, which, I mean, was not a student initiative, but just that was sort of a particular thing I did while other people were doing other particular things. And so it really is very good, I think, the program and the administrators, and this is a credit to Susan and Maureen, at sort of reaching out wherever people want to interact and whatever level of sort of energy they want to put in, and sort of matching it and exceeding it and helping it grow. And so I think, you know, even if you don't do an internship, you can have a wonderful experience with the Human Rights Program and sort of from the program, and it can really augment or even sort of fundamentally change your college experience for the better, or university, I should leave it to college.
Andrew?
Well, I actually
I'm sorry, Christine wanted to jump in.
Yeah. I think that it's, without the internships, the Human Rights Program would still be incredibly rich and offer a great deal, but it would be lacking in practice. And you can have an event on campus, you can even have an action, target the president's office or something, and you're in the practice, you're doing something. But the nature of the University of Chicago is just that things take on a very conceptual, theoretical, you know, side. And you end up talking about it and maybe not necessarily really figuring out what you're going to do about it. So getting out there and really, you know, just being in it up to your eyeballs, that's incredibly important. And I would not, I mean, you know, going to the Thai-Burma border and having very deep relationships with people who had been so personally affected, and living with my students day in and day out, and hearing about growing up inside Burma or in a refugee camp, and then bringing what I was learning from the University of Chicago to them, that was really important, and it's a tricky thing to figure out. So being able to do that early, I think, you know, it did a lot for, you know, my, for the time being, short career as a human rights advocate, just really understanding what it's like to be there and do it, rather than sort of reading about it and talking about it.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one comment, maybe about comparative numbers. I think every year we probably have at least 200 students who have taken a human rights course. which when we're looking at a college of between 4,000 and 5,000 students isn't huge, or and if you pull all the graduate programs in, it's not huge, but it's a very significant number. And there are students who take one human rights course and have a very specific focus in their other work. And so taking the human rights course gives them descriptive language to talk about whatever else it is that they're interested in their, whether it's the project of writing a BA thesis on microfinance or getting a master's degree in social work. The other thing about the internship program is that, and I forgot to say this in the opening, is that by providing the capacity, by having the money to make these funded interns, I think we do a lot with this program in a rather subversive way to take class off the table in terms of what kinds of summer experiences students can have. As the mother of a student at Wesleyan University, where they don't have a lot of funded opportunities for students in the summer, and is true at a lot of institutions, the kids who get to do interesting projects in the summer are those whose families can afford either to have them not work at all and just support them, or can afford to pay an agency that for $4,000 will, paid by the student's family, will set them up with a summer working on a housing rights project in Costa Rica. And that's not to say that those experiences aren't valuable, but by having a needs-blind program here at Chicago, any student who is interested in having this kind of experience can do it because it's funded. And it doesn't have to take the place of a summer job. This can be your summer job. And to me, that's a principle of access and equality that is very important and helps everybody get the maximum, everybody who can participate in the program get the maximum possibility out of their education, not limited still even within an institution that gives financial aid, that provides a lot of support for its students from all backgrounds. It's not your parents' capacity to support you for the summer, pay for an interesting experience that's going to make a difference as to having that kind of access. And so I think that's another part of it, which the internships brings to round out what is the terrific classroom experience, which is, of course, accessible to everyone within the student body. But there is that little spoken about question of social class and family wealth that can make a big difference in students' experiences, and hopefully we can help neutralize that as a factor for at least a certain segment of the student body. And there are other programs that do that. I mean, Summerlinks does this, the Metcalfs does it. The college and the university does make a very good effort at having funded summer projects of a wide range of sorts, and supported in large part by alumni like you. But we'll get to that later. Andrew Hammond, did you have a question? Yeah.
That's a very good question, Andrew. I think my challenge is always to do what's most effective. And, you know, I learned so much from, you know, ex-prisoners who are now community activists and were community activists then in North Belfast about ways that you can use human rights. A lot of people are afraid of human rights. A lot of people from communities that have traditionally been majority communities of power can see human rights language sometimes as a very threatening thing. And the biggest thing that working in Belfast taught me was about just the expertise that exists on the local level. And I don't know that I'm going to effectively answer this. For me, I think that you're getting... my experience has been that when you're doing rights work, the most important element of that is participation and getting people involved. Because once you get people involved in the process, then you can give them a context to understand your use of rights language. Because if you go straight into rights language, sometimes people are, for example, right to health care, socialized medicine. If you talk about, do you think that people should have access to, every woman should be able to have access to prenatal care so that people start off with a fighting chance? Well, then, people will agree to that. Well, do you think that, it goes farther and farther. And once you've talked to someone for a longer period of time, they'll have accepted lots of the premises of your question. And then you can say, well, that's what a right to health care is, and you're getting there slowly. I think our challenge in the work I'm doing with Senator Obama's campaign, that I'm not speaking as a representative of, is what I love about the campaign is that it takes organizing really, really seriously. It takes participation really, really seriously. When I first started on the campaign, I worked in the policy department, and we have over 1,500 people on our policy committees now, I think. And that was because our policy committees are on, I think, 20 different topics. And we basically said, do you want to have an impact on our healthcare policy, on our education policy? We want you. We want your opinions. We want your ideas. Come and talk with our experts on I think some of the committees meet every week to talk about developments in these certain issues and flesh out our ideas and what our policies should be. And I think that participation is really critical. And we do that on the local level in our organizing when we're talking to people about what issues are important to them, what values are important to them. And we train them as not as people who can make phone calls for 5 hours a week and that's it, and then they go home. What we do is we get their buy-in into the process of what we're trying to do, and we develop leadership and we develop neighborhood teams. And the idea is that those teams will be here after this primary is now over, and they'll be there past November as well, because the thing that's important is not winning, but having people on the local level that are organized and that can hold Congress accountable and can hold the president, whoever that may be, accountable. And I think once you have people organized, then you can do you can have a more effective rights argument. But obviously, it's going to depend what type of groups you're talking to. And in some communities, it's less effective up front. In some communities, you go straight to the right stuff. I don't know if that answers your question.
We had an event here a couple of weeks ago that the students who are here now know about, which is that we were able to host the visit of the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Issues of Racism from the United Nations, who came to Chicago to hold hearings with community groups here on campus. And one of the cases that was discussed is something that we've taught about in the courses, which are the police torture cases from Chicago, which have gone unresolved, the torture of, 170 over 200 African-American men at a particular police district in the city. And it seems to me maybe the answer to the question as to when you can effectively use human rights, I think, particularly with these cases, it's an example of when there seems to be no other remedy, when there's impunity for under the local and domestic systems, and then you try to reach beyond that to an international level. And those of us who were at the hearings at iHouse, it was pretty raggedy and the testimony wasn't really terrifically organized, but there was a real will and passion and interest in the room that to break beyond local power structures and be able to talk about international human rights, about problems that didn't seem to have a local remedy, was something that we were very pleased to be hosting and helping. So I agree with Mo. I mean, you don't start necessarily with the human rights argument, but it can be a tool among others. And part of, I think, the study, and I'll hand the mic back to Nick because Andrew asked him, is this question of when in history does this happen?
No, take it. Talk about the year of freedom for me.
I mean, what's interesting is that I think recently, historians have started in some respects to redefine movements that haven't always been referred to as human rights movements as such. So there was a book, I can't remember the author, about that was referring to the human rights movement in Atlanta. Of course, it's talking about what we think of as the civil rights movement. But I think as historians, it's important to contextualize things like this. And this is what I was talking about. Human rights as a discipline allows us to understand and really illuminate the kinds of things that happened in the post-war period in terms of the civil rights movement, both here and abroad, in ways that are very fundamental to how this movement was developed and also to how we can understand it and how it affected people. One thing I think is interesting, I find often, and I think Mo's right about this, particularly in developed sort of first world countries, you have this thing like, Zimbabwe has human rights problems. We just have social deprivation and issues that we need to deal with. And Britain is the worst at this, actually, in my experience, or at least Oxford is. And so I've had a hard time, but an interesting time, of trying to get people to think about these things as human rights problems. Because if I say, it's funny, if you even say there was a civil rights movement in Britain, people get very offended. Oh, well, it's not the same thing. It's not very different. Well, no, it was, frankly. And it was a human rights movement, and it's important to think of it as such. And so, I mean, again, it's a different angle. I'm not trying to achieve policy objectives. objectives. I'm writing history. But I've enjoyed and taken relish, and we'll see how it comes out in the grade, but in sort of calling these things this and sort of trying to make this explicit. And I think it's important to do that, particularly when you're contextualizing the past, because it allows us to, again, see different trends in history, but also to kind of, to get this out on the table. Yes, we're talking about human rights, and we're talking about civil rights. And this happened at the time. I mean, Malcolm X went to the UN. People involved in the movement I look at in Britain were constantly referencing this language. And what they realized, which is interesting, and I'll stop because this is now I'm riffing on my master's thesis here, but that you can be very effective because you can shock people into action with this sometimes. So in Britain, if you're a local guy, you can't get served at the pub, you go down, you hang out, someone comes, takes you away, you get arrested, that's back-page local news. But if you show up and say, I'm here for my human rights and I'm having a sit-in, now the London Times wants to take pictures. And it's a very good way to galvanize people who don't think of these issues as being present in their communities, to say, this is not that different from what happens often in these places that you think of having human rights problems. These are connected issues, and it's very important to connect them that way. So again, I mean, I have the luxury of not trying to accomplish practical objectives, but I like doing that, and I think it's, I think it's effective in a sort of sidelong way because it brings that language into the lexicon.
Yanisi, do you, as somebody who's in a PhD program in history and also working on some of these social justice issues, do you want to? I saw you nodding your head, so I'm going to ask you to.
I disagree with the last thing Nick said, which I rarely disagree with Nick, but I'm trying really hard to write a thesis that does achieve practical objectives. And sort of to answer and go back to your own question, this might sound as blasphemy, but I first would never have been able to afford the human rights internship if I didn't work for this program. I thought of human rights and backpacking and skiing all in the same category, like a bourgeois luxury rather than like a necessity and sort of a responsibility before I came to human rights programs. That it gave me a sense that I too had a right to be active and participate. So that's one. But the thing that I found most interesting was this like metaphor that Susan kept throwing around, which you're in one of my footnotes in one of my papers.
Thank you.
She used to scribble it in notes while we would have conferences. And I'm really trying to develop that as a thesis, especially for the Caribbean at the moment. Is precisely because, for instance, if I can redefine things like the Haitian Revolution as a human rights movement and really tie what are these Caribbean islands that are all being exploited and often thought of as individually, if it can, I think only a regional human rights conception of portable rights will ever save the Caribbean at this moment in terms of policy objectives. I don't know if that works for other regions of the world, but sort of my entire thesis and the ideas I'm trying to develop in my own work as a history major, which is about to get kicked out of school, precisely because I keep pushing so hard that this is a project I want to do, is really what I'm committed to. And I'm willing to sort of even switch programs if I can't get that done. But there is definitely a lot of hesitation, and even the most progressive professors, my school claims to be very liberal, but I tend to disagree with it. I push hard, and the only reason why I have the confidence to push hard is because I keep hearing all these phenomenal individuals that also have the same ideas as I do, and sort of like nod their heads and think, yeah, that's right, so you don't feel crazy. A PhD program of like 6 people who all think you're crazy. So I really don't want to write a thesis stuck in the 19th century that doesn't have a policy objective. So.
Thank you. So just to reply to you, I don't. Sorry, I think I misspoke. I don't mean. No. I didn't want to suggest that. I don't mean to think that. I would hate to think that history doesn't have practical objectives and implications. I more meant that I'm not in the immediate business of, say, winning funding. All right, and so I don't feel a need to temper the language. And right, I don't know the grade I got, so we'll see how it goes. But and I applaud you also for not tempering the language because I think that's really important, and it does have a real practical objective.
Yeah. I don't, for instance, New Haven has had some of the biggest immigrants, and I kept pushing the city to create an ID card for documented and non-documented migrants using a human rights language. The problem now that we're having is sort of codifying that in the actual city law. So it's like an honorary thing, and all of the major politicians have signed off on it, but no one wants to legislate it. And that's where the real resistance to the forward human rights language is. But I refuse to amend the language precisely because we won't ever have a breakthrough. We start to pull back, and there's a lot of activists now. We're all in big fights, and we leave each other nasty voicemails because they feel I'm not negotiating. And I feel if we push through, even New Haven is a small city, that could really serve as a model of codifying what is human rights language, even at the local level. So it's like a give and take. I'm currently losing the battle.
Well, I invite you to the University of California, San Diego. I'll give you some promotional literature afterwards if you like it.
You want to switch PhD programs?
Let me just say something. This is really interesting. The history of actually calling something like the Haitian Revolution a human rights revolution or the French Revolution is actually probably more faithful to the historical actors than not calling it. And in fact, it's the intervening history that has erased that. And in the United States, it's the era of the Bricker Amendment and the 1950s, and there's no accident that this overlaps with institutionalized segregation. Institutionalized segregation, protecting it meant insulating the United States from international law explicitly. And in terms of the local level activism and going to court and using human rights language, one of the things that I've been most surprised about is how well it works. We've used human rights language in juvenile court in Cook County doing special immigrant juvenile visa cases with family court judges. It doesn't work with every judge all the time, but actually developing a moral language, but a moral language that's not an amorphous moral language, one that actually has standards, documents, and a whole hierarchy of law, a system to it, can be really effective, and it can be effective all the way up through. It may not work with 2 or 3 judges on the Supreme Court, but that shouldn't dissuade us from using it at many different other levels.
I think we're supposed to wrap this program up at 2:45, so I just wanted to thank our panelists and the fact that we have someone working full-time on a presidential campaign, someone doing microfinance, someone doing international solidarity work, 2 academic historians who are trying to put human rights in history, and a doctor, show how this path that we start on here can take us in a lot of different directions. I want to thank all of you for your participation in the program, the richness that you have brought to my life, and on Maureen's behalf, too. We have learned a tremendous amount from our students' perspectives, and all of our faculty, Marvin Mackinnon from the Board of Directors just walked in. The faculty are quite interested in this. And there is actually, as you know, I think the historians, there's a particular now critical mass of historians in the last 2 years through some new faculty coming in. There are now 5 professors in the history department, 6, who do human rights. And they are developing their own project, which is going to have a real University of Chicago mark on it and help take our ideas into classrooms all over the country. So I want to thank all of you for the work you do, the work you're going to do, and remind all the former human rights interns here that we're going to walk over from here to the Franke Institute in Regenstein Library to have our internal evaluation and reflection discussion. And so thank the panelists, thank all of you for coming.